Welcome to Brain Wellness, the podcast. I'm your host, Mandy NP. Each episode will bring you a new topic or interview related to brain health and wellness as part of my mission to help you on the path to a healthier, happier brain. So, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Hill. Dr. Hill is the founder of Peak Brain Institute and a leading neurofeedback practitioner and biohacking coach for clients worldwide. At Peak Brain, Dr. Hill provides individualized training programs to help you optimize your brain across goals of stress, sleep, attention, brain fog, creativity, and athletic performance. Super excited to have you here today with me, Dr. Hill. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Mandy.
Yeah. So my first question for everyone is always just tell me a little bit about your story. What got you to where you are right now? How'd you get to be the neurofeedback guru that you are?
I've been doing neurofeedback in one form or another for about 25 years. And before that, I worked for about a decade in acute human service work. So I managed group homes for people with multiple disabilities. So they had no language, often no vision, often cognitive deficits as well. So really acute developmental difficulties. And after doing that for a few years, I ended up going into acute inpatient psychiatric work, working with crisis, both in adult as well as a geriatric population and then a kid population. So I had all this really rich but kind of deep suffering experience across different areas of human stuff. And I was working in a psychiatric hospital in Massachusetts, one of the more, at the time, aggressive locations to work. And I got injured and couldn't keep the job that I had effectively. And the hospital closed down soon after that. So I was sort of like, well, I can't really go to the jobs I was doing before in psych hospitals. And okay, what should I do? And I went and got a job in high tech and worked in doing tech development, tech engineering, tech evangelism for a few years. And to give you some sense of when this was right before the year 2000 big tech correction, the bubble correction. So I was, in high tech right when that was happening. I was like, well, maybe I want to get back to working with people because the tech boom is slowing down. So I went and got a job working in an autism center that used neurofeedback. I heard about this stuff called neurofeedback. I was kind of excited to check it out. And I ended up working in this center, seeing mostly kids with autism, ADHD, anxiety, seizures, childhood sort of developmental category stuff. And what I saw blew my mind because people were getting changes in an order of weeks. And you'd see somebody come in really dysregulated, lots of seizures, crazy ADHD, tics, something. And within a few weeks, you're seeing changes in behavior. And after a couple of months, you're seeing measured change in assessment data. And I had been working with people who we were doing our best just to like keep them safe, sometimes inpatient or working in group homes. I spent a year, 1 year teaching a guy to use a fork. That was our big accomplishment was he went, from not using a fork to using a fork. And it was just reinforcement learning. It's just really tedious. And then I'm seeing extremely dysregulated kids in like 6 weeks, 8 weeks, ratchet down their dysregulation, like really dramatically to the point where teachers are calling home and thanking parents for whatever they did. And it really shocked me. And it sort of flew in the face of what I thought was possible for helping brains. And at the time, this was, again, long time ago, the field was still pretty young. It's not that old now, but, EEG is only 100 years old this year, and neurofeedback was discovered in the mid sort of 1960s in this clinical form. And, half its life, basically 25 years ago, the three or four schools of thought in the field were still all arguing about how it worked and what to do. And there were open questions about what was happening and what the mechanisms were. And my way is the right way. No, my way is the right way. And a lot of that vitriolic fighting in a little tiny niche area of psychology, essentially, crabs in a bucket,
Mhm.
climbing over each other and really aggressive fighting. This is before the internet, the modern internet. This is back when we had Usenet stuff, so to give you a sense of how long ago it was. And all of these greats in our field were leaving these long diatribes around technical stuff and, disparaging other tool sets. And what really struck me as somebody new in the field, learning all this stuff, was that no matter what tool set was in use, the effects they were getting were better than what I had seen across a decade of working with acute cases without fail. And I was like, this is really, really weird. Like, they're all arguing about this, and yet it seems to work a lot better than all the stuff that I've seen. What's going on? And in some ways it was even worse because the ideas that each of these three schools of thought had were not reconcilable. They had different ideas about how the brain works, how learning works, and yet they were all getting good results. So this is a blind men and elephant situation, right? We have a piece of something we're describing without some good perspective. So I ended up going back to grad school to figure out, well, how is it working?
Mhm.
How does the brain know when you are rewarding brain waves?
Yeah.
We have the technical setup. We stick wires to the head. We measure the brain in real time. When that changes, we applaud that back to the brain. But how does the brain know? How does the brain figure out where's that informational loop happening? We were doing very systematic sort of recipe book stuff in the field 20 years ago, and we didn't really understand necessarily why we would do some things. Do this, that works. And there's still some of that, some amount of clinical lore persists in the field. But a lot more now we can go, oh, this phenomenon in the brain, okay, we should do this to address that. And it's a much more straightforward perspective. But at the time I was doing my grad work, it was an open question really on if it worked, in the mainstream. People were a little skeptical. There's a lot more research now, but the research still lags the clinical practice, mostly because we don't do neurofeedback the way the research is done.
Mhm.
It's a very individualized process like personal training.
Mhm.
And most of the research doesn't do that. It just takes these like two groups, does one thing for each group, and then does short amounts of neurofeedback. So it's kind of a weak comparison.
Mhm.
But you can still find good impacts on many things in spite of that in the literature. So I was going back to grad school without a huge amount of literature, and very little on like mechanism or what's happening. The initial research on neurofeedback, the discovery, if you will, happened at UCLA in the mid 60s by mistake. Cats were being exposed to rocket fuel to examine how dangerous rocket fuel was. And a certain subset of those cats refused to have seizures. All the rest of the cats were having really bad effects from rocket fuel exposure. But 8 of the 32 cats were like, nope, we're not having seizures. Other cats were having seizures 40 minutes in. The other cats were like 2.5 hours in, looking a little bit unsteady, but not having the seizure events yet. And the person who did this experiment, Dr. Barry Sturman, was like, have I discovered a special cat? No, he turns out another experiment he'd done 6 months prior. He put an eyedropper taped into their cheek and squirted chicken broth into their mouth whenever they made a brainwave the cats make a lot of. If you've seen
Mhm.
a cat lying on a windowsill watching birds, that still body and laser-like focus is a mode that animals go into. It's called sensory motor rhythm. And predators do a lot of it because it's a combination of being deeply physically relaxed or inhibited and cognitively, attentionally very, very focused. That state, that high SMR state, is the opposite of ADHD, like literally the opposite of ADHD, where you have trouble maintaining the inhibitory tone,
Mhm.
and instead other brainwaves take over. But Sturman picked SMR because cats make these huge surges of SMR, sensory motor rhythm, and trained it up. Okay, great. You can condition it. Wonderful. Go back in the subject pool cats. And 6 months later, these cats were seizure resistant.
Huh.
So he trained his lab manager who was having uncontrolled seizures on major meds, Tegretol, Mebarol, Dilantin, and she was still having tens of seizures every single month. And they built her an auditory feedback machine. And over a year, she used it, went off all of her meds, and was then seizure free for a year. And that was the
Wow.
start of the neurofeedback field. But it's all phenomenological. This for autism, that for seizure, this for ADHD, that for trauma.
Mhm.
And then we got into brain mapping or QEEG, where you can start to see the phenomena in your brain that might relate to regulatory features that we often give labels to, but like ADHD is not your brain. That's a particular behavioral set of characteristics that probably have 2 or 3 big physiology resources that might be cramped up in particular ways. but one diagnosis might have four or five or 10 or 20 or a, infinite number of things you might see in a brain. So brain mapping is not a diagnostic process. It's looking at your brain saying, hey, look at all the weirdness. Cool. Let's figure out what's plausible. How much of this might track things you understand? And the stuff we can see somewhat reliably ends up being the stuff the field of neurofeedback can relatively, with some good confidence, change. It's these features of attention, stress, and sleep, seizure, migraine, sensory processing, speed of processing, and sensory. Social sensory speed, attention, stress, and sleep, and then the stability stuff, migraines and seizures. That's the low-hanging fruit for neurofeedback. There are other things it can do, cravings, creativity, flow states, immune system. But in the landscape of neurofeedback, we think about the cortical resources of the brain, the big rich hubs, the default mode network, the salience network, brain laterality, language areas, visual, all the cortical stuff. And that's not that mysterious. I mean, it's a little bit, it's weird. It's your brain, it's hidden, but it's not nearly as mysterious as people think.
Mhm.
So brain mapping becomes this process of sitting down with somebody and saying, hey, look at your brain. Here's something that's plausible. And people go, yes, yes, that's me. So you're usually not telling somebody new, something new about
Mhm.
themselves when it comes to brain mapping. You're usually helping somebody figure out, oh, the stuff that I care about is showing up like that. Oh, okay. And you crystallize your perspective on it because you get a sense of how weird or how quirky or how it might operate.
Mhm.
So this gives people agency. And then that's also given the neurofeedback landscape these other tools to start doing very tailored work towards someone's particular goals, even if they don't fit a diagnostic bucket or sort of an intervention recipe book. You end up working with a person at a very individualized level to explore resources, shape resources, pursue it. So long-winded answer, but I have this personal training perspective on neurofeedback because I went into first the research perspective on how is it working,
Mhm.
and then from there brought it out into more of a sort of startup landscape with both high performers as well as addiction as well as traditional neurofeedback goals of childhood stuff as well. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's
that's
where I am.
I love that. So as I mentioned before we started hitting record, I did have another conversation about neurofeedback a few weeks ago, and I was hoping we'd get into it even deeper. And you have not disappointed so far. So I love all the details on it. So all of those different theories of why it was working. Did you come up
Mm.
with a good explanation for why it does?
Oh yeah, sure. I demonstrated how the brain knows that the stuff on the screen or the audio is itself essentially. So the experiment I did, one of my experiments for my grad work was looking at, well, let me back up. Let me explain how neurofeedback works,
Yeah. Yeah.
technically, how we set it up, what's actually happening, and then I'll back up and tell people what the other half is, what I discovered in the brain.
Perfect.
So neurofeedback is essentially something called operant conditioning. It's just exercising the brainwaves, but the behavior conditioning is involuntary. So that's where it gets kind of weird because you can't really feel your brainwaves. So conditioning them is this process where your brain is learning, but the mind's like, really, this is stupid, until it starts to kick in. 2, 3 sessions in, usually for neurofeedback, you feel it, not right away typically.
Mhm.
What's happening? Let me give you a classic example. There's a circuit on the right-hand side of the brain that supervises our attention. It's involved heavily with aspects of executive function, with sleep, of behavior, and it uses that low frequency beta, that sensory motor rhythm, 12 to 15 hertz, to sit still, relax, resist waking up at night, not go squirrel, so pump the brakes appropriately, supervise, turn here, no, 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 come on, that kind of like pulling back gently, just right side circuit. And it uses beta waves, low beta waves to do its job. Often, in some people, anyways, theta waves, which is a release brain wave or a lubrication, takes the brakes off the circuit. Theta might be really high there in some people, and the beta might be relatively low. And that produces a lot of disinhibition. People that are more driven by the outside world, that react, that are hunters, not gatherers, that
Mhm.
have this sort of mode they choose really based on what is demanded by the outside world. So they're really good at high stimulus, high intensity, high conflict, less good at doing their taxes. And that is a low supervisory state, but it's a very high performance state under high intensity. So, again, aspects of that sound like ADHD, basically. So you often want to train this sensory motor rhythm, this SMR frequency up because it will make your brain more able to sleep, more able to sit still. It'll reduce seizures. It'll reduce a bunch of stuff. It also causes a huge plasticity surge in the brain for about 24 hours. So we love to train SMR.
Mm-hmm.
So you stick a wire there, put some ear clips on, and typically set the computer up to measure your brain as you make that brainwave, the amount of those beta waves moment to moment, and maybe the amount of the theta waves as well, moment to moment on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever your brain briefly shifts in the right direction, computer sees that and applauds your brain by making stuff on a screen, some audio, a little gameplay start to happen. The brain's like, hey, I like stuff. Stuff's cool. Hey, there's some stuff. And then it moves in the wrong direction. The beta dips, the theta climbs, and the game slows down or stops. The brain says, oh, I don't like no stuff. Where's my stuff? And then it happens to move in the right direction. The applause continues and it goes, and then there's this process in the training where we move the goalposts. We adjust every few seconds next to where the brain is. So we're only catching the movement in the proper direction to applaud. My big question was, well, how do we know? Like, how does the brain know that those beeps are, contingent on the actual brain waves? Is there a training process? And there was some question 25 years ago, is it the attention you're being paid by your therapist? Is it, what is it going on here? I mean, there was open questions on those Usenet servers. People are arguing about, does it matter where you put the wires? Does it matter which frequencies you train? Or is it just exercise, pure? So those are the big questions I wanted to answer. What is happening in the actual informational loop? Does it matter? Left versus right hemisphere? Does it matter low beta waves versus high beta waves as the reward? So 12 to 15 or 15 to 18, which is a more higher frequency beta. The left, the corresponding circuit in that precentral area, it uses faster beta, 15 hertz and above, for stabilizing vigilance and also stabilizing the depth of sleep. It's the mode maintainer, essentially. So these two big circuits, C3, C4 in neurofeedback parlance, left side, right side, central strip, are big maintainers of sleep and executive. They're often trained. They're very conserved across a lot of complaints and goals. So I targeted those in an experiment where we put training wires on those locations and put a 64 channel cap on top of that. And then set people up to get rewarded on changes in beta or low beta on the left, beta on the right, or sham, meaning they were getting rewards that were not contingent to their brain in real time. So we stored some EEG and then derived training rewards off of stored files that were not theirs and had no time locking their relationship to their brain. And then we trained 5 days in a row. And we watched what evolved in the brain over that time. Oh, and the last bit of, for the neuroscience geeks in the audience, we took the reward event, the beep that happens when the brain's just spent half a second doing the right thing, and we embedded it in the ongoing 64 channel EEG record as a series of events. And over that half an hour, oh, and I also, we trained with nobody in the room. We set people up and left. Just kept an eye on signal quality from another room. So we had a sham condition. We had left side beta, left side SMR, and right side SMRs, 4 conditions, 4 different groups. And watch what happened with the EEG. It turns out within 5 minutes, if you're not doing sham training, within 5 minutes, the brain starts to burst in the frequency you're rewarding under the location you're rewarding. The brain's like going, every beep that happens causes a desynchronization, a surge in the beta. If you're rewarding SMR, after a few minutes of that, whenever the brain hears a beep that has applauded the SMR it has just made, it makes another little surge of it or an amplitude event that causes a phase difference. So you can see the brain going, whenever you applaud the brain wave. And that little surge of activity does not happen everywhere. It happens under the electrode, and it doesn't happen that much on the opposite side. It doesn't happen at all if you're applauding things that are not contingent to the person. You still see an auditory event. You still see the beep happen in a slow frequency auditory event, but you don't see the desynchronization called an event-related spectral perturbation. You don't see that if the person's getting a sham reward. The beep causes an auditory event, but there's no beta surge that happens afterwards. So I demonstrated side of the brain matters, sham matters. It shows up instantly within a few minutes. And this is important because one of my big questions clinically before I went to grad school was, why do we have to spend 10 or 20 sessions just
Mhm.
getting to some good movements for some people? For some people, they sit down the first session like, oh my gosh, angels are singing, the world is bright. Oh my gosh, I feel amazing. That's rare. One person out of maybe 50 has that experience though.
Mm,
And maybe one person out of 50 is like, yeah, I never felt it.
mm,
But a month in, their sleep is great, or they're not drinking alcohol or whatever, seizures are down. But there's no subjective experience. And most people are in a mid place where 2 sessions in, 3 sessions in, 4 sessions in, they're like, hey, wait a minute. Huh. I might be feeling something. Okay. And then it wears off and they're, I was imagining that. And then they do it again. Oh no, wait a minute. There's that neurofeedback thing. And at that point, you can change protocols each time and get a different subjective effect. And
mm,
that's the real core of neurofeedback practice is this personal training. Well, how'd that feel? We're
mhm,
getting goal congruent movement. Did you notice anything? Oh, you did? Great. Do it again. Oh, you didn't? Oh, it was a little bit too wired after that and it was back off.
mhm,
So we know we get subjective effects, but one of my questions is why is it 5 to 10 sessions in for really getting that movement? Is it really taking the brain this long? Is
mhm,
there, why is there a dose effect? What's happening? And no, it just turns out you need to build up enough of an effect for the mind to participate because it's just not a very big effect initially. The brain notices, the brain starts to learn within 5 minutes, and you can see it on a screen. You can tell if neurofeedback is happening. So the loop of information flowing from the person's brain out into the filters to the game and back to the brain, I demonstrated that it exists and that it's different based on if you do beta training or low beta training or no training. You can see the distinctions. And then I even did in 5 days of neurofeedback some lateralized attention testing. The lab that I got my PhD in was a laterality lab, left right hemisphere. And my mentor, Dr. Aran Zaidel, he was a grad student for Joe Bogan, Roger Sperry, who did all the initial split brain subjects, surgeries on people for epilepsy. And a lot of that was looking at hemispheric function as well. So Dr. Zeidel's lab was focused around testing attention in each hemisphere separately using tactistoscopes. You flash information very quickly on the screen and you flash it to either left hemisphere, well, left visual field, right
mhm,
visual field while fixing the middle. And based on which hand you respond with, you can actually constrain the ask of information into one hemisphere or the other,
mm,
or force it to use both hemispheres based on which mouse hand you're using and which visual field you're sending information into. So you can suddenly test attention, go, no go style attention, or orienting to spatial stuff and attention in one hemisphere at a time. And so showing that there's two separable attention systems that converge late to create our experience of attention really informed my perspective on how things like ADHD work, certainly. But I did a lot of testing with all of these like 75, 85, 95-year-old split brain subjects that
mhm.
were all the initial people. I went back through them all and did all this testing and learned how their brains work. And it was very, very cool. I learned a lot about laterality. But you can see the laterality in the neurofeedback as well. You have this perspective of taking left, right hemispheric control. And then we're starting to figure out that things like ADHD and just general executive function, it does have a very strongly lateralized left as the vigilance maintainer and the stabilizer of that resource, and right as the supervisor and steer and inhibitory tone and gently pumping the brakes. So that perspective, I went into grad school having had, more than a decade of experience. I knew about brains, and I knew I was experienced neurofeedback, but my perspective on the brain that I learned in this environment with Dr. Zeidel changed how I did neurofeedback because it
Mhm.
created this deep perspective on left-right hemisphere coordination. The field of neurofeedback had been working with what's called the arousal model, activation of anxiety and stress and sleep and fatigue. And so that plus my experience with developing brains plus the laterality stuff means that I've created a system of doing neurofeedback that's a little tiny bit different than most of my colleagues.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of colleagues in the field. It's a small field. Only about 5,000 people in the U.S. or so do this, and about 15,000 worldwide. But I have this neuroscience perspective first, not a psychology perspective. So I'm not looking at the DSM or the diagnostic labels. I'm not trying to find your diagnosis in a brain map. I'm teaching you how your brain works. You know what you're feeling and what your goals are. So when I teach you how your brain works, you're like that. that over there, can we change that? Oh, okay. If we see that, yes. Not hard to change data with neurofeedback. Really, actually pretty easy. It's hard to know what to do to get an effect. It's hard to understand a brain. But once you know what you're working on, you can put your thumb on that resource and you can gently move it. How'd that feel? It's mysterious, but not blind.
Mhm.
So you have this opportunity to get in there and try things. And neurofeedback is transient too, initially. Eventually, it's not. 40 sessions, 50 sessions in, it starts to really become permanent.
Mhm.
Early on, people are kind of weird. And, the goal is not to say, why isn't your brain average? The goal is to say, look, do we see things in your performance test and your brain maps? Oh, you care about this. Okay. Now let's see if we're right. Now let's see from the
Mhm.
ballpark of understanding you.
Mhm.
And so then you teach somebody about their brain, let them pick goals, they get excited. Even before you start neurofeedback, there's this lovely thing that happens where you teach them about their rumination or perseveration or seizure disorder or whatever it is. And you show them in physiology and in data pictures of what's going on that they already know deeply.
Mhm.
And it's suddenly a lot harder to feel overwhelmed or ashamed or guilty about our brain thing. I mean, you got a broken arm, people are sympathetic,
Mhm.
but if you're extra sensitive to rejection and it rules your life, people aren't that sympathetic.
Yeah.
And that could be a trauma response or a feature of ADHD or could be really be in the way and a real feature. And if you have social and sensory tissue that's turned up to 11, wow, look at that. You're a fairly sensitive person. Maybe you're empathetic and emotional, maybe you're flooded, but you can start to look at your brain as part of your body the same way you look at other resources. Hop on your fitness, your body fat scale, look at your blood lipids, look
Mhm.
at your deep sleep on a tracker, maybe look at your alpha speed, maybe look at your theta beta ratios, maybe look at, you know, instability events. Learn your brain, take control of it. That's my big soapbox here with this stuff at this point. So
Yeah. Super fascinating. So you talked a little bit about how you can't diagnose things, but you can see patterns. Are there any
yeah.
other things that QEEG can or can't do that would be important to
Sure.
know?
The most valid thing, the thing that rose to diagnostic validity at one point, but then dropped away a little bit, is ADHD. Dr. Vince Monaster did some research in the 80s showing that the ratio of theta to beta tracks ADHD, blindly sorts thousands of people from, like pre-diagnosed, but blind on that, into a bucket of ADHD with 94% accuracy. And inattentive ADHD has a high alpha signature, which is a neutral frequency, 81% of the time. Really powerful. Like that's better than most discriminants we have in general markers like blood ranges and things. That's a better predictive.
Mhm.
However, as grad students kept repeating that research every year, it got weaker and weaker. And doing a lot of discussions at conferences, we all kind of decided, well, what we're seeing here is sleep issues creeping into the adolescent population over a decade, washing out the sensitivity of this effect because high theta, high alpha when you're awake. Yeah, it's ADHD. It's also lack of sleep regulation,
Mhm.
perhaps,
Mhm.
as a cause. So those two things look like each other. Concussion can look the same for some people. So physiology, phenotypes, and tissues in the brain do not track the diagnostic label buckets.
Mhm.
They don't fit perfectly. And people are weird. So what
Mhm.
is a problem for one person is not a problem for somebody else. And the goal is not to say, because you're average, there's something wrong. And brain mapping is used as an average reference. You have to use a sum measurement, and age-related populations are pretty stable. So you can think of this like it's a measurement, but it doesn't matter if it's a yardstick or a meter stick. It's just a comparison. So you
Mhm.
have some reference about what's sticking out. And then you can really learn brain mapping when you start to remap and do repetitive maps. So I teach people to understand their own brain maps. That's the first thing we do.
Mhm.
But then someone, I tell somebody ahead of time, oh, you have to come in without caffeine. And they groan. Oh, really? Yeah, to get a clean brain map, you have to have been off caffeine from at least 4 o'clock the day before. And for things like Adderall, et cetera, it's like 48 hours to get a clean EEG.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, no, I'm not sure I can come in without coffee. Oh, well, we have really good coffee in the office. We'll make you some. But why don't you do two brain maps? Why don't you schedule two? Let's do a caffeinated one as well. Or
Mhm.
the person's like, I can't stop smoking weed, doc. Can you do 24 hours? Because that'll clear your EEG. It's enough if you're a daily user. 24 hours is plenty to clear the EEG. Not if you're an occasional user, but if you're
Hmm.
chronic, if you use it for pain or for, excessive recreation, you don't want to stop, 24 hours gets you enough visibility. But let's do a stone map. Let's do
Hmm.
one. Or a map with your Adderall, or a map with your whatever it is, your pre-workout. I don't care. If there's stuff in your lifestyle you rely on, you prescribe to you, let's do an acute map or a contrast map, because I can teach you about brain mapping faster
Hmm.
with a contrast condition on the screen. You know how Adderall feels or cannabis feels. And when I show you that your Adderall wakes you up and makes you a little more crisp and focused, but also makes you make more errors because it's addressing your sleep, not your ADHD, you know that already. And when you point, oh yeah. Or I've had like teenagers, say, my mom really wants me to stop smoking weed, but it's the only thing that helps my anxiety. And the mom's like, is there any way we can demonstrate that weed isn't good? I was like, well, we can look at their brain
Hmm.
and see what it's doing. And you discover that, okay, it looks like your kid is self-medicating appropriately with cannabis, actually, because there's really strong trauma stuff that's being brought down really well. So this anxiety and migraine, the 17-year-old is using it for, you know, I think we need to take a harm reduction approach here, mom, not necessarily, think of it as an abuse paradigm necessarily, because your kid said some things ahead of time and seemed to be borne out with this data. So it's just agency again. I'm not pro or anti any of these things, any
Hmm.
medication or any intervention, but you can use the maps to dial in your meds. When you change meds, it shows up. The chair of my dissertation committee, Dr. Andy Luchter, he's the sort of placebo researcher. He's done all the placebo research. And he also did a study on something called cordance. He also manages the STAR-D depression studies for all the big drug companies, looking at all the big, frontline medications for depression. And that's sort of why he's also the placebo guy.
Hmm.
But he did a study showing an EEG measure in the brain called cordance, which is a ratio of absolute to relative power in the frontal lobe. 7 to 10 days after you start an SSRI, your brain has changed. And you often haven't felt it by that point. The brain changes well in advance of your experience, and you might not feel it for 3 to 5 more weeks. But it predicts if the antidepressant is going to work or not.
Hmm.
So, from a clinical management perspective, you get somebody in crisis who needs medication management. You can change the meds, wait a week, look at the EEG, and get a good sense about what direction the person's brain is being encouraged to shift in.
That's
So there's all kinds of like predictive, there's phenotypes in the brain that predict if certain medication is going to work on you as well. Like I can look at your brain and tell you, if you're ADHD, let's say, I can look at
Mhm.
your brain and tell you which medications to ask your psychiatrist about,
Hmm.
because your brain is the one that doesn't generally work well with stimulants, but might work well with this or that or the other.
Hmm.
You can tell that from brain mapping often, or aging or injuries. If you're aging, your alpha waves slow down.
Mhm.
And I'm having word finding issues. Is that just, my alpha waves, or is there a concussion? What's going on? It's just your alpha waves slowing down. Your sleep is dysregulated. Improve your sleep, meditate, you'll speed back up versus
Huh.
something more major. You can see that distinction.
Yeah.
Or God forbid somebody gets COVID or a concussion, you can see post-COVID brain in an
Mhm.
EEG really clearly. For
Mhm.
most people, if it's symptomatic, you can. Even if not symptomatic, you often can. And same thing with concussions. Half of all concussions or brain injuries are silent,
Mhm.
and for 5 to 8 years have no symptoms. And then some of those produce brain fog, slow processing, even seizures later, because there's a delay sometimes for brain injuries. But 3 to 6 months after somebody gets COVID, 2 to 6 months, you can see the neuroinflammatory signatures, and they look just like concussions for most people.
Mhm.
COVID, chemo, mold, Lyme, apnea, all kind of look the same.
Hmm.
And you don't really care what it is. You don't really care if it's an old concussion or COVID last year, or you don't care too much, as long as the person's not reintroducing causes. Like it's going to be hard to get over brain fog if you're sleeping underneath a moldy AC unit,
Mhm.
and that's
Yeah.
why. But if you had a concussion, if you had an injury or an illness and you've been knocked over by it, systems are regulatory. You can change. You just got to shape that change a little bit. So
Hmm. Hmm.
Anyways, you can get the agency is more important than neurofeedback in some
Yeah.
ways. The QEEG can be more powerful. And I've had a couple parents bring their kids in saying, "Oh, my kid's going to college soon. They can't organize their way out of a paper bag." And the kid's like super ADHD or something. And we do a brain map, we do a performance test, and I sit down and say, "Look, here's your brain. Here's some strengths, here's some weaknesses. This is hard to control. This is awesome. That's powerful. Hey, you might want to think about controlling it this way, just orienting them to the resources."
Mhm.
And they leave, and I'm like, "That was a great candidate for neurofeedback. I'm sure I'll see them." And I don't see them again.
Hmm.
Okay. 4 years later, 5 years later, I get a call. "Hey, Dr. Hill, just wanted to thank you. That thing you said to my son, my daughter, it's all they needed to hear. They suddenly started to apply themselves, went to college, developed some structure, got into it. They needed to hear that they were, smart and powerful in spite of this, and just be given a little perspective on how to maybe move through it and some couple of hacks, couple of strategies." And they ran with that, and they're graduating top of their class now. They're super excited. They're getting their first job. They're in med school now. So I hear that sometimes even without the neurofeedback.
Hmm.
So I hear that a
Learning
lot
truth.
with neurofeedback too. Like, "Oh,
Yeah.
our kid has just graduated. Thank you, thank you." But there's a lot you can do with just knowing yourself. So that's my big takeaway. My big message for everyone in this landscape of weird neurofeedback stuff is start with a brain map, start with a QEEG.
Yeah.
Make sure you get someone to sit down with you and go over it and explain what's there. It won't be mysterious. It should make sense to you.
Mhm.
And it should then tell you what you should do to your sleep, your meditation practice, maybe some nutrition, maybe some exercise. And it gives you all these, places you can instantly start to make change.
Mhm.
So
Very
brain
cool.
mapping, QEEG, come get one.
Yeah. So there's different technology out there. There are different companies that do the QEEG. If you if one person say were to go to multiple different places, is the QEEG going to look the
Mm.
same or might it look different?
For the most part,
Okay.
there's about 3 or 4 back-end commercial database products that contain thousands of cases of clean data, as well as tools to process the data and output the comparisons. Um, but a QEEG is just a quantitative processing of an EEG. And the EEG is the same EEG you would do at a sleep lab or an
Mhm.
epilepsy center.
Mhm.
It's just seated upright for 20 minutes, not lying down, and no flashing in your eyes. But you can take the EEG gathered by any QEEG provider, you can reprocess it with the tool sets that a particular provider uses, and it's interpretable across providers. Um, there's really about 2 different ways of looking at QEEG in the commercial tools. And there's a lot of similarity across the big tools in the field.
Mhm.
So I could take any database output and look at it and go, "Oh, okay, you're seeing some of this, maybe some of that." It's also really important to look at raw data. People don't always do this, but you should look at your raw data and know what the blinks and the coughs and the movement, teeth grinding, because EEG is noisy and you're going to be looking at some noise in your flat maps. So it's good to look at your raw data, look at performance as well. You must always look at an attention test or something like it. Otherwise, you're just getting data
Mhm.
without the framing you need. And then the EEG itself. Within the EEG, the QEEG you get, you could take that to any other provider and they could sit down with it. But every single person you do that to will say, "Hey, can I have the raw data?" Because they'll want to both look at the raw squiggles and they'll want to reprocess it, make their decisions about where the filter cutoffs are, which montage or spatial visualization of data you want to use.
Mhm.
So, yes, but this functional medicine doctor might use this range for, B12, and this functional medicine person might care about
Sure.
this hormone. So you'll get different things in the reports, the high level reports that providers prepare for you that are not convergent, that do a little bit of high level judgment, that do some
Mhm.
derived things that are special features of certain databases. I don't love that actually.
Mhm.
I teach people to read the basic, it's called Neuro Guide, one of the big tools in the field. Maybe half or 2/3 of the field uses that as their QEEG database and tool set. And I use Neuro Guide to process data, and I process a couple hundred pages of data for every map, and I pull out about a dozen pages and teach people to look at a couple different montages, a couple different aspects, power, speed, connectivity, And then I walk them through all of the features they have, because we all have quirky outliers. We're all kind of weird.
Mhm.
So it's not a question of if you're weird, it's how. And also, it doesn't matter. So I'm not saying, oh my gosh, you aren't average on this bell curve. No, it's like, oh, hey, look, this part of the brain's unusual in this way with this brain wave. Sometimes that can mean this. Oh, that rings true. Cool. We're probably seeing something real. Does it matter?
Mhm.
Oh, you don't mind that quirk. Great. Awesome. Go you. How about this thing? Or, oh, you maybe really do matter. Okay, well, then I'm sorry you experienced that bit of suffering. That's frustrating.
Mhm.
And look we see it. It's a completely different way of working with it. I'm not in charge of the definition. I'm not saying you have ADHD.
Yeah.
I'm saying, oh, look, the left side of your brain is not making as much beta as the average kid your age. And you kind of spaced out during the performance test, dude. This beta on the left-hand side helps us stay crisp and clear and bright and keep the spotlight on the road when things are boring. Is that hard
Mhm.
for you? Oh, it is. Is that annoying? Oh, it is. Yeah, I bet it is. You could meditate and make this beta come up, and it would actually make your spotlights brighter, or you can do some neurofeedback and train up the beta, make some change.
Mhm.
So I get to the place of, oh, here's the ADHD,
Yeah.
but I'm not telling them that that's that perspective, because people know how they
Mhm.
feel. So I'm also not a doctor. I have a PhD, but it's in neuroscience. So I really want to be a scientist when I'm educating you, and then a coach when I'm helping you design interventions. So my joke is, doctors are great, but they have to be right. Go to
Mhm.
doctors for answers. Come to scientists for questions. We'll
Mhm.
help you dig through data, look at things, come up with ideas. And then once we have some perspective, we move into coaching role where we iterate through interventions, and we just are on your team as you move through making transformation, and then go back to science to do more assessments and more, hypothesis generation and exploration. So that's really
Yeah.
how we're different in the neurofeedback landscape. Almost everyone are therapists.
Yep.
Um, and we're closer to like your high-end gym, your Equinox or your Soul Cycle, and we have that Soul Cycle model. We send equipment home, coaches and screens cheer you on and have you do brain mapping and neurofeedback from your living room. So we really make it much closer to a personal training experience, hopefully, for people where they own the transformation, they drive it, they decide what to go after. So
Yeah. Yeah. I
that's our
love
big
that.
soapbox.
I love it. I love
Thanks.
it. I could probably sit here and ask you questions all day long. But I think for sake of time frame, do you have any upcoming events or anything you want to share with listeners, if they want to connect or get to know more about all of this?
Yeah, sure. So of course we're all over the socials. Come check us out at Peak Brain LA usually. Also, I'm on YouTube. I do a live stream every Monday where I do neurofeedback on myself and talk about what I'm doing, the protocol, what it's trying to do in the brain. And then I launch into some biohacking topic where we talk about how to hack sleep or how to hack IQ or how to hack anxiety.
Mhm.
So if you want to come hang out and ask me real-time questions, come see me on YouTube. It's YouTube/Dr. Hill. And yeah, neurofeedback is this thing that I don't think it shouldn't be mysterious the same way that, these days we all track our sleep and look at our lipids, and, our parents didn't do that.
Mhm.
Our grandparents didn't think about, blood sugar,
Mhm.
right? We're all dialing everything in, and we're younger. I'm in my mid 50s. Don't I look young? I'm joking, but like my parents are also relatively young in their 70s, but like their parents in their 70s, my parents, we're progressively getting younger as we learn to take care of ourselves
Mhm.
in this country, in this culture. There's this concept in gerontology I'll leave us with, which is the compression of morbidity. You want to take your illness and your aging and your infirmity and compress it right into the very last moments of your life. So you slide into death with a good looking sports car running at the peak of its, function right up until the moment it all breaks down and falls apart. And
Mm.
neurofeedback, just like exercise or watching your blood sugar, these are all things you can do to flatten trajectories. So you don't end up having 30 years of aging. You end up having 3 years of aging right at the end of your functional range. So take control, people.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we're in National Biohacking Month too, I think. So
Ooh,
perfect time for this conversation.
there
Um,
you go.
Great stuff. Like I said, I could totally ask you questions all day long, but this is absolutely fascinating. I would definitely recommend people go watch you. Like I said, I was checking out on LinkedIn beforehand. You've got a lot of cool stuff out there that I think we just touched the tip of the iceberg with it all today. So thank you so
Brains are
much for being
cool.
here. They
Brains are cool,
are. They are. I saw a
right?
sign one time that said brains are cool. I wish everyone had one, but you have proof that everyone has
Oh,
one.
I've never not looked at a brain and not found something. I've never done an EEG. Although I'll
Yeah.
tell you, I use that joke. I put a cap on and go, "Oh, we found brain waves. Good for you." And people
Yeah.
laugh most of the time,
I did that with
you know.
imaging. So anytime I was ordering CTs
Uh-huh.
and MRIs in the hospital, they'd ask if I found anything. Well, yeah, I found a brain. So you can tell your
Yeah,
spouse that.
you're
So,
good. You're good. Yeah, exactly. So,
so a
Danny,
different way to
thanks
look
so
at
much
it.
for having me on the
Yeah.
show. Really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. Awesome. Great. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to subscribe, like, and share this with others to help me continue on with my mission to help people live healthier, happier lives. Go to www.brainwellnesssolutions.com to see what I'm up to and get links to all the social medias there. See you next time.